Margaret Whitmore stood in her penthouse kitchen, phone pressed against her ear, her perfectly manicured nails tapping impatiently on the marble counter. The voice on the other end was apologetic but firm. The pianist she'd hired for tonight's dinner party had the flu and wouldn't be coming. "You've got to be kidding me," Margaret muttered, ending the call. She glanced at the clock on the wall. Her guests would arrive in exactly 2 hours, and she'd promised them an elegant evening with live piano music. Everything had to be perfect. It always had to be perfect. At 62, Margaret had built a real estate empire that spanned 3 continents. She owned hotels, office buildings, and luxury apartments that most people could only dream of visiting, let alone living in. Her Manhattan penthouse took up the entire top floor of one of the most exclusive buildings in the city. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered views of Central Park, and her living room housed a Steinway grand piano that cost more than most people's houses. The piano had been her late husband's passion, not hers. She'd kept it after he passed, mostly because it looked impressive and made for good conversation at parties. The truth was, nobody in the apartment could even play it. It just sat there, beautiful and silent like an expensive piece of furniture. Margaret walked through her apartment, mentally reviewing everything for the evening. The caterers were already in the kitchen preparing a 7-course meal. The florist had delivered arrangements of white orchids and roses. The wine had been selected, the table set with china that cost more per plate than some people earned in a month. But without the piano music, something was missing. Her guests expected a certain level of sophistication, and she'd specifically mentioned in the invitations that there would be live classical music. These weren't just any guests. These were investors, business partners, people whose opinions mattered. People who noticed details. She was about to call another agency when she heard a familiar voice from the staff area near the kitchen. Elena, her housekeeper, was speaking Spanish to someone. Margaret walked toward the sound and found Elena talking to a teenage boy sitting at the small table in the staff break room. His backpack was on the floor, textbooks spread out in front of him. "Elena," Margaret said, making the older woman look up quickly. "Yes, Mrs. Whitmore?" Elena stood up straighter, always professional, always polite. "Who's this?" Margaret nodded toward the boy. "This is my son, Daniel. He's waiting for me to finish." "I hope that's okay. He does his homework here sometimes instead of going home to an empty apartment." Margaret looked at the boy properly for the first time. He was maybe 16 or 17, wearing a faded hoodie and jeans that had seen better days. His sneakers were worn at the edges, the kind you keep wearing even when they're falling apart because new ones aren't in the budget. "Hello," Daniel said quietly, not quite meeting her eyes. Margaret's mind was already moving, connecting dots. She remembered something Elena had mentioned months ago, maybe even a year ago, something about her son taking music classes at school. Or was it piano lessons? She couldn't quite remember, but it was worth asking. "Elena, does your son play piano?" Margaret asked. Elena's face brightened slightly. "Yes, he does. He's been playing since he was 8. He practices at his school every day after classes." "Really?" Margaret felt a surge of relief. Maybe this problem could solve itself after all. "How well does he play?" "He's very good," Elena said, and there was pride in her voice. "His teacher says..." "Perfect," Margaret interrupted, already moving on to the solution in her mind. "Daniel, I need a favor. My pianist canceled for tonight and I have important guests coming. Could you play some background music during dinner? Nothing complicated, just something pleasant. Classical pieces, maybe some jazz. You know, the kind of music people can talk over." Daniel looked surprised, then uncertain. He glanced at his mother, who gave him an encouraging nod. I guess so," he said. "What time?" "Guests arrive at 7. You'd play from 7:30 until about 9:30. 2 hours. I'll pay you $100. She saw Elena's eyes widen slightly. $100 was probably good money for them, Margaret thought. She felt pleased with herself for offering such a generous amount for such a simple task. "Okay," Daniel said, his voice still quiet. "I can do that. Wonderful. Elena, make sure he's presentable. Maybe one of the catering staff has an extra white shirt he can borrow. Something clean and neat." Margaret was already walking away, pulling out her phone to check on other party details. Crisis averted. What Margaret didn't see was the look that passed between mother and son. She didn't see Elena's hand squeeze Daniel's shoulder, or the way the boy's jaw tightened slightly. She didn't notice the careful way he closed his textbooks, as if he was closing a door on something important. When the guests started arriving that evening, The apartment glowed with soft lighting and the scent of expensive candles. Women in designer dresses air-kissed each other's cheeks. Men in tailored suits discussed stock markets and property values. Wine flowed freely, and laughter echoed off the high ceilings. Daniel sat at the piano in the corner of the living room, wearing a borrowed white shirt that was slightly too big for him. His own jeans and worn sneakers were still on. Nobody had thought to offer him anything else to wear. He looked out of place and he knew it. He started playing as instructed. Chopin, then some Debussy, then a few jazz standards he'd learned. His fingers moved across the keys with practiced ease, finding the notes without effort. But as he played, he realized something that made his chest feel tight. Nobody was listening. Not really. The guests talked and laughed, their voices rising over his music. Someone set a wine glass directly on the piano's polished surface, leaving a ring of condensation. A woman in a silver dress leaned against the piano while talking animatedly to a man about her recent vacation in the Maldives. Completely unaware that Daniel had to adjust his position to avoid her elbow. He was invisible. Just part of the scenery, like the flower arrangements or the expensive art on the walls. His music was just noise to fill the space, no different than if Margaret had put on a playlist. Margaret walked past several times during the evening, always with guests, always talking about business or travel or the latest Broadway show. Once she glanced in his direction and gave him a quick nod of approval, the way you might acknowledge a waiter who's doing their job adequately. She never asked what he was playing, never asked where he'd learned, never asked if he was tired or needed a break or wanted some water. To her, he was Elena's son doing a simple favor, nothing more. When the evening finally ended and the last guests left, Margaret approached him with a smile. She pulled 5 $20 bills from her purse and handed them to him. "You did great," she said. Really added to the ambiance. "Thank you." "You're welcome," Daniel replied, taking the money and folding it carefully. As he and Elena left through the service entrance later that night, Margaret was already in her bedroom, changing into silk pajamas and thinking about tomorrow's meetings. The evening had been a success. Her guests had been impressed. The dinner had been perfect. She never gave Daniel another thought that night. Not even once. But for Daniel, walking home with his mother through the cold city streets, the evening stayed with him. The money in his pocket felt heavy, earned but somehow wrong. He'd played some of the most beautiful music ever written, pieces that had taken him years to master, and nobody had even noticed. "You played wonderfully," Elena said softly, linking her arm through his. Daniel didn't answer. He just kept walking, the sound of his own music still echoing in his head, along with the memory of voices talking over it, drowning it out, making it disappear. The next morning, Daniel sat in Mr. Chen's tiny office at Lincoln High School, the room barely bigger than a closet. Posters of famous composers covered the walls, their faces faded from years of sun exposure through the single small window. The upright piano in the corner was missing 2 keys, and the bench wobbled if you sat on the left side. "So how did it go last night?" Mr. Chen asked, looking up from the stack of sheet music he was organizing. He was in his 50s with gray streaks in his black hair and reading glasses that he constantly pushed up his nose. Daniel shrugged, pulling the 5 $20 bills from his pocket and spreading them on the desk. "Got paid." "That's good," Mr. Chen said, but he was watching Daniel's face carefully. "But that's not what I asked." Daniel was quiet for a moment, staring at the money. They didn't listen. Not one person. "I could have been playing with my elbows and nobody would have noticed." Mr. Chen nodded slowly. He'd taught music at this underfunded public school for 23 years. He'd seen talented kids like Daniel before. Kids with gifts that the world seemed determined to ignore because they came from the wrong zip code, wore the wrong clothes, had parents who cleaned houses instead of owning them. "You played Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat, didn't you?" Mr. Chen asked. "Yeah, and Debussy's Clair de Lune, and some Bill Evans. Pieces that take years to master." Mr. Chen leaned back in his creaky chair. "Daniel, you know what you are, right? You understand your own ability?" Daniel looked up at his teacher, the man who'd stayed after school with him almost every day for the past 6 years. The man who brought in his own sheet music from home because the school's music budget had been cut 3 times. The man who'd paid Daniel's competition entry fees out of his own pocket more than once. "I'm good," Daniel said quietly. "I know I'm good. You're beyond good. You're exceptional." You're the most talented student I've had in 2 decades of teaching. Mr. Chen pulled out a folder from his desk drawer. That's why we need to talk about this summer program again. Daniel felt his stomach tighten. They'd had this conversation before, and it always ended the same way. With hope dying against the hard wall of reality, the Berkshire Summer Music Academy. 6 weeks of intensive training with some of the best piano instructors in the country. Students who attended had a 90% acceptance rate to top conservatories. Going there could change everything for Daniel. It could open doors to Juilliard, to scholarships, to a future where music wasn't just something he loved, but something he could actually build a life around. Mr. Chen, we already talked about this. It's $50,000. That's not happening. I know the cost seems impossible, Mr. Chen said, opening the folder. But look at this. They have scholarship applications. If you get in, if they hear you play, they might cover most of it. You just need to pay the application fee and maybe some of the housing costs. How much is the application fee? $500. Daniel looked down at the $100 on the desk. 5 weeks of his mother's grocery budget, a month of their electricity bill, and he'd need 5 times that amount just to apply, with no guarantee of anything. My mom works 2 jobs, Daniel said, his voice flat. She cleans Mrs. Whitmore's penthouse 3 days a week, and she works at the hospital laundry room the other 4 days. Last month our landlord raised the rent. Again, we're barely making it as it is. I know, Mr. Chen said gently. I know it's not fair. But Daniel, if you don't try, then what? I end up like every other kid from my neighborhood, working retail or food service, never using my talent for anything except playing at rich people's parties for tip money. Daniel's voice cracked slightly. Maybe that's just how it is. Mr. Chen was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that surprised Daniel. You're angry. I'm not. You are, and you have every right to be. Mr. Chen took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. You're angry because you played your heart out last night and people treated your music like elevator noise. You're angry because you've worked harder than most of those rich kids will ever work at anything. And you're still the one who can't afford opportunities. You're angry because talent should be enough, but it's not. Daniel felt something tight in his chest loosen. Nobody had ever said it out loud like that before. Yeah, he admitted. Yeah, I'm angry. Good, use it. Let it fuel you, not stop you. Mr. Chen pushed the folder across the desk. Take this home. Show your mother. Maybe we can figure something out. I can talk to some people, see if there are other grants or programs. Daniel picked up the folder knowing it was probably pointless but unable to completely let go of the hope. That was the worst part, he thought. The hope that kept refusing to die no matter how many times reality crushed it. After school, Daniel did what he always did. He went to the auditorium where the piano was kept. It wasn't a great piano. The action was sticky, some notes didn't sound right, and it hadn't been tuned in at least 2 years. But it was his piano in a way, the one place where he could play without being background noise. He sat down and started playing, not the classical pieces he'd performed last night, but something else. Something he'd been working on for months. His own composition. It started soft and searching, like a question being asked in the dark. Then it built, became more complex, layers of melody weaving together. There was anger in it, yes, but also beauty. Also hope. Also the sound of every emotion he couldn't put into words. Daniel played for 2 hours, losing himself completely in the music. He didn't notice when the janitor came in to empty the trash cans. He didn't hear the drama club setting up for rehearsal in the hallway outside. He was somewhere else, somewhere where his music mattered, where it was heard and understood. What Daniel didn't know was that his music was being heard. Mr. Chen had recorded him playing his original composition 3 weeks ago, and he'd submitted it to 5 different programs without telling Daniel. He didn't want to get the boy's hopes up, but he also couldn't let talent like this disappear into the void of poverty and lack of opportunity. One of those recordings had reached someone important, someone who made decisions about scholarships and futures, someone who would remember Daniel's name, but that day was still months away. For now, Daniel was just a kid playing a broken piano in an empty auditorium, pouring his soul into music that most of the world would never hear. When he finally finished and looked up, the auditorium was dark except for the stage lights. His fingers ached. His back was stiff from sitting so long. But for those 2 hours, he'd felt like himself, like someone who mattered. He packed up his sheet music and headed out into the cold evening air. His mother would be finishing her shift at the hospital soon. They'd take the bus home together, stop at the bodega for whatever was on sale for dinner, and maybe watch TV in their small apartment before she had to go to bed early for her morning shift. It was an ordinary life, a small life by most standards, but it was theirs. And somewhere in Daniel's backpack, tucked into his notebook, was that folder from Mr. Chen, the one with the impossible dream printed on expensive paper. Daniel wasn't sure he believed in dreams anymore, but he couldn't quite bring himself to throw the folder away either. Maybe that was enough for now. Maybe that tiny, stubborn piece of hope was what separated giving up from keeping going. He'd decide later. Right now, he just needed to get home. The bus was crowded and smelled like wet coats and exhaustion. Daniel found a seat by the window and watched the city pass by. All those lit windows hiding all those different lives. Somewhere in one of those buildings, Margaret Whitmore was probably having another expensive dinner, making another business deal, living in a world so far from his that they might as well be on different planets. She'd already forgotten him. He was sure of that. He was just the housekeeper's son who played piano that one time, a minor character in her story not worth remembering. But Daniel remembered. He remembered every note he'd played, every person who'd talked over his music, every moment he'd felt invisible. And somewhere deep inside, he made a promise to himself. One day people would listen. One day his music would matter. He just had to figure out how to get there. 3 months passed like they always did. Winter turned to early spring, and Margaret's life continued in its usual rhythm of meetings, investments, and social obligations. She'd completely forgotten about the evening when Elena's son had played piano at her dinner party. It had been such a small moment in her life, barely worth remembering. Tonight, she was attending a charity gala at the Plaza Hotel. Music education for underserved youth was the cause, and Margaret had bought a table for $10,000. Not because she cared particularly about music education, but because her business partner's wife was on the organizing committee, and these things were good for networking. The ballroom was elegant, filled with women in evening gowns and men in tuxedos. Margaret wore a navy blue dress that cost more than most people's monthly rent. She sat at her table making small talk with the other guests, half listening to speeches about the importance of arts education while checking her phone under the table. And now, the host announced from the stage, we have a very special performance. These are some of our scholarship recipients, young people who've benefited from your generous donations. First, we have Daniel Rivera, a 17-year-old pianist from Lincoln High School. Margaret glanced up, only mildly interested. Then she froze. Walking onto the stage was Elena's son. He looked different than he had that night in her apartment. He wore a simple black suit that was probably borrowed, but he carried himself differently. More confident. More present. He sat at the grand piano, adjusted the bench, and placed his hands on the keys. Then he began to play. The room fell silent. Completely silent. This wasn't background music that people could talk over. This was something else entirely. The piece started quietly, almost fragile, like the first light of dawn. Then it grew, became more complex, layers of melody building on each other. There was something raw in it, something honest. You could hear struggle in the music, and hope and anger and beauty all mixed together. It wasn't just technically perfect, though it was that too. It was deeply, achingly human. Margaret sat frozen in her chair, unable to look away. This was the same boy who'd played in her living room 3 months ago, the same boy she'd barely looked at, barely spoken to, barely acknowledged as anything more than a convenience. Around her, other guests were equally transfixed. A woman at the next table had tears running down her face. A man who'd been checking his phone had set it down, completely absorbed. The entire ballroom seemed to be holding its breath. The piece built to a crescendo that made Margaret's chest feel tight, then resolved into something quieter, more peaceful. When the final notes faded away, there was a moment of absolute silence. Then the room erupted in applause. People stood, including Margaret, though she felt like she was moving in a dream. Daniel stood and bowed, his face serious. He didn't smile. He just nodded once and walked off the stage as the applause continued. Margaret sat back down slowly, her mind racing. She felt something unfamiliar and uncomfortable. Shame. Deep, burning shame. She thought about that night 3 months ago. How she'd asked him to play like it was nothing, like anyone could do it. How she'd never asked about his training or his dreams. How she'd paid him $100 for 2 hours of work and thought she was being generous. How she'd told him to play music people could talk over. The gala continued, but Margaret couldn't focus. She kept seeing Daniel's face. The way he'd look sitting at her piano, young and uncomfortable in a borrowed shirt. She kept hearing the difference between the music he'd played that night, carefully chosen background pieces, and what he'd just played now. His own composition. His own voice. When the event ended, Margaret did something impulsive. Instead of going home, she had her driver take her to the Riverside apartment building where she knew Elena lived. She'd sent Christmas bonuses there for years but had never actually visited. The building was old, with cracked concrete steps and a front door that didn't quite close properly. The elevator groaned and shuddered on the way up to the 4th floor. The hallway smelled like cooking oil and cleaning products. Margaret had never been in a building like this before, not in decades. She knocked on apartment 4C. Elena opened the door, her eyes widening in shock. "Mrs. Whitmore, is everything okay? Did I forget something at work?" "No, Elena, everything's fine. I need to talk to you. May I come in?" Elena stepped aside, clearly confused and nervous. The apartment was tiny, maybe a quarter the size of Margaret's living room. But it was spotlessly clean, with family photos on the walls and a small kitchen table covered with textbooks and sheet music. "I was at a gala tonight," Margaret began, still standing because there wasn't really space to sit. "Daniel played. I didn't know he was that good, Elena. I had no idea." Elena's confusion shifted to something else. Something harder. "I told you he was talented. I told you many times," Margaret thought back, trying to remember. Had Elena mentioned Daniel's music? Yes, probably. But Margaret had never really listened. Elena talked about her son the way all mothers talk about their children, with pride and hope, and Margaret had smiled politely and thought about other things, more important things, things that actually mattered to her life. "You're right," Margaret said quietly. "You did tell me. I didn't listen. I'm sorry." Elena crossed her arms, waiting. She wasn't making this easy, and Margaret realized she shouldn't expect her to. The piece he played tonight, was that his own composition? Yes, he's been writing music since he was 12. He has notebooks full of pieces he's written. Elena gestured to a small desk in the corner where stacks of music paper sat next to Daniel's school books. "Why didn't you tell me he was performing tonight?" Elena's laugh was short and sharp. "Mrs. Whitmore, I tell you things about Daniel all the time. About his competitions, his performances, his dreams of going to Juilliard. You smile and nod, and then you ask me to make sure I vacuum under the dining table." The words stung because they were true. Margaret had employed Elena for 8 years, saw her 3 times a week, and had never bothered to really know her. To really listen. To see her as a full person with her own complicated life, not just someone who cleaned her home. "He needs to go to that summer intensive program," Margaret said. "The Berkshire Summer Music Academy. I looked it up after the performance. It costs $50,000, doesn't it?" Elena's face shifted, became carefully neutral. "Yes, it's not possible for us. I'll pay for it." "No." Margaret blinked, surprised. "What?" "No," Elena repeated, her voice firm. "Thank you, but no. Elena, I can afford it. It's nothing to me. Let me help." "Why?" Elena asked, and there was an edge to her voice now. "Why do you want to help now? Because you saw him play at a fancy gala? Because you suddenly realized he's not just the cleaning lady's kid? Where was this generosity 3 months ago when he played at your apartment and you barely looked at him?" Margaret felt her face flush. "I know I should have—" "Do you know what that night did to him?" Elena interrupted. "He came home so quiet. He told me he felt invisible, like his music didn't matter because he didn't matter. Do you know how hard I've worked to keep him confident, to keep him believing in himself? And then one night at your apartment almost broke that." "I'm sorry," Margaret said, and meant it. "I'm truly sorry. But Elena, he's extraordinarily talented. That program could change his life." "I know what he is," Elena said, her voice softer now. "I'm his mother. I've known what he is since he first touched a piano at 8 years old. I've watched him practice for hours on broken school pianos because we can't afford one at home. I've seen him compose music on paper because he doesn't have a computer with music software. I've held him when he cried because he knew he was good enough for Juilliard, but we could never afford the application fees, the travel for auditions, any of it." Margaret stood there, feeling smaller than she'd ever felt in her life. All her money, all her success, all her power, and she'd never seen what was right in front of her. "Let me help," she said again. "Not because I feel guilty, though I do, but because he deserves the chance, please." Elena was quiet for a long moment, studying Margaret's face. "I need to talk to Daniel. It's his decision. Of course, and Mrs. Whitmore. If you do this, if we accept your help, it can't be about making yourself feel better. It has to be about him, about his future. Not your guilt." Margaret nodded. "I understand." She left the apartment feeling shaken. In the elevator going down, she caught sight of herself in the scratched metal doors. She looked exactly the same as she had that morning. Perfect hair, expensive dress, flawless makeup. But something inside had shifted. She'd spent her whole life building an empire, accumulating wealth and power. She'd thought she knew what mattered. But tonight, listening to a 17-year-old boy play a piano, she'd realized how much she'd been missing. How many people she'd looked past. How much humanity she'd ignored in her pursuit of success. The real question was what she was going to do about it now. Writing a check was easy. Actually changing, actually learning to see people, that was much harder. As her driver took her home through the city streets, Margaret made a decision. Whatever happened with Daniel, whether he accepted her help or not, she was going to do better. She was going to listen. She was going to see the people around her as complete human beings, not just functions in her life. It was the very least she could do. And it was long overdue. Daniel sat on the fire escape outside his bedroom window looking out at the city lights. It was past midnight, but he couldn't sleep. His mother had told him about Margaret's visit an hour ago, and his mind hadn't stopped racing since. $50,000. The summer program. Everything he'd been dreaming about for 2 years, suddenly within reach. All he had to do was say yes. So why did it feel so wrong? Can't sleep either? Elena appeared in the window, wrapping a cardigan around her shoulders against the cool night air. "It's charity, Mom," Daniel said quietly. "She feels guilty, so she wants to throw money at the problem. At me. Like I'm a problem to be solved." Elena climbed out onto the fire escape and sat beside him, their shoulders touching. Maybe. Or maybe she finally opened her eyes and saw something she should have seen a long time ago. Does it matter? Either way, I'd owe her. I'd be the poor kid she rescued. The charity case, Daniel's hands clenched into fists. I've worked my whole life to be good enough, to earn my place, and now the only way I get to go is because some rich woman feels bad? Pride is expensive, Elena said softly. Trust me, I know. I've swallowed mine every day for 8 years, cleaning her toilets and dusting her piano while she barely remembered my name. Daniel looked at his mother, seeing the tiredness in her face. She worked herself to exhaustion every single week. For him. So he could stay in a school with a music program. So they could keep their apartment. So he could have a chance at something better. I'm angry, he admitted. I'm so angry, Mom. At her, at the system, at everything. These rich kids, they get piano lessons from the time they're 5. They have Steinway grands in their living rooms. They go to summer programs every year like it's nothing. And I have to beg for scraps and be grateful for whatever falls off their table. I know, baby. I know. Elena put her arm around his shoulders. And you have every right to be angry. The world isn't fair. It never has been. But here's what I learned. Working for people like Mrs. Whitmore all these years, you can be angry and still take the opportunity. Those two things don't cancel each other out. It feels like giving up, like admitting I can't do it on my own. Nobody does it on their own, Elena said. Those rich kids don't. They have parents paying for everything, opening doors, making connections. Why should you have to do it alone when they never did? Daniel was quiet, thinking. His mother was right, he knew that. But the anger didn't go away just because the logic made sense. If I take her money, I have to see her, thank her, pretend to be grateful. You don't have to pretend anything, Elena said firmly. You can take the help and still be yourself. Still be angry. Still want to change things. Maybe you'll do that better from Juilliard than from here. They sat in silence for a while, watching the city breathe below them. Finally, Daniel spoke. Okay, I'll do it, but on my terms. The next day, Daniel asked Margaret to meet him at a coffee shop near his school. Not her penthouse. Not some fancy restaurant. A regular coffee shop where students studied and people actually looked at prices before ordering. Margaret arrived 15 minutes early, looking uncomfortable in her designer coat among the worn booths and chipped tables. Daniel made her wait. He showed up exactly on time, ordered a regular coffee, and sat down across from her. "Thank you for meeting me," Margaret started, but Daniel held up his hand. "I need to say something first." He kept his voice level, calm. "I'll accept your help with the summer program, but I have conditions." Margaret looked surprised but nodded. "Okay, first, this isn't about you. It's not about your guilt or your need to feel like a good person. It's about me and my future. I need you to understand that." "I do." "Second, I don't want to hear how lucky I am. I'm not lucky. I'm talented. I've worked harder than most people will ever work at anything. Getting help isn't luck. It's finally getting what I should have had access to all along." Margaret's face flushed, but she kept listening. "Third, after this summer, we're done. I don't want to be your project or your charity case or the feel-good story you tell at dinner parties. I want to succeed on my own merits. Is that clear?" "Crystal clear," Margaret said quietly. "Anything else?" "Yeah, one more thing." Daniel leaned forward. "I want you to really think about why you didn't see me 3 months ago. Not just me, all the people like me, the ones who serve your food and clean your houses and park your cars. We're not invisible. We're not background noise. We're people with dreams and talents and lives that matter just as much as yours." The words hung in the air between them. Margaret looked down at her untouched coffee, then back up at Daniel. "You're right," she said. "About all of it. And I know this doesn't fix anything, but I am genuinely sorry. Not just sorry I didn't see you before, but sorry for the whole system that made it possible for me to not see you, to not have to see you." "Sorry doesn't change much," Daniel said. "Action does. What action would you like to see?" Daniel hadn't expected that question. He thought for a moment, then said, "There are dozens of kids like me at my school. Talented kids who'll never get the chances they deserve because they can't afford them. If you really want to help, don't just help me. Help them too." Margaret pulled out her phone and made a note. "Tell me more," and so Daniel did. He told her about Mr. Chen paying entry fees out of his own pocket, about the broken piano in the auditorium that nobody would fix because the arts budget kept getting cut, about students who had to choose between buying sheet music and buying lunch, about talent being wasted every single day because opportunity was locked behind a price tag most families couldn't afford. Margaret listened. Really listened, taking notes, asking questions, not interrupting. It was strange, Daniel thought, seeing her actually pay attention, actually care, or at least try to. When he finished, Margaret said, "I'd like to set up a fund, not in my name, administered by people who understand these barriers like Mr. Chen. Would that be helpful?" "It would be a start," Daniel said carefully. He didn't want to give her too much credit, but he also couldn't deny that it would make a difference. "I'll have my lawyer draw up the paperwork next week." Margaret stood up, extending her hand. "Thank you for being honest with me, for not making this easy." Daniel shook her hand. "Thank you for the opportunity, even if it took you way too long to offer it." Margaret laughed, a genuine sound. "Fair enough." As she left the coffee shop, Daniel sat back down and let out a long breath. He'd done it. He'd taken the help without compromising himself, without pretending everything was okay, without being grateful for crumbs. His phone buzzed. A text from Mr. Chen. "Did you talk to her?" "Yeah," Daniel typed back. "I'm going to Berkshire." 3 dots appeared then. "I'm proud of you. Not for taking the help, but for not losing yourself in the process." Daniel smiled. Mr. Chen always knew exactly what to say. That summer, Daniel went to Berkshire. It was everything he'd hoped for and harder than he'd imagined. He was surrounded by kids who'd been training at elite music schools their whole lives. Kids with confidence that came from never having to doubt whether they belonged. But Daniel had something they didn't. He had hunger. He had the memory of every time someone had talked over his music. Every time he'd been invisible. Every time he'd been told, subtly or not so subtly, that kids like him didn't get to dream big. He practiced longer than anyone else. Worked harder, pushed himself further, not to prove anything to Margaret, but to prove something to himself. That he belonged here, that his talent was real, that he could stand beside anyone and hold his own. His instructors noticed. By the 3rd week, one of the most respected piano teachers at the program pulled him aside. "You have something special," she said. "Raw talent, yes, but more than that. You play like someone who has something to say. That's rare." "Thank you," Daniel said. "I'm writing you a recommendation letter for Juilliard. You should apply for their full scholarship program. I think you have a real shot." Daniel walked out of that meeting feeling like he was floating. This was it. This was the door opening. Not because of charity. Not because someone felt sorry for him, but because he was good enough. Because his music spoke for itself. He called his mother that night. "Mom, I think this is really happening." "I always knew it would, baby," Elena said, and he could hear the smile in her voice. "I always knew." But even as everything started falling into place, Daniel couldn't shake the complicated feelings about how he'd gotten here. The anger was still there, just beneath the surface. The knowledge that he'd needed Margaret's help because the system was broken. Because talent alone hadn't been enough. He decided that when he made it, when he was successful, he'd remember this. He'd remember what it felt like to be invisible, and he'd make sure other kids like him didn't have to wait for a guilty billionaire to notice them. That was the promise he made to himself. That was how he'd turn the anger into something useful. For now, though, he just focused on the music, on getting better, on proving that he belonged here and always had. The rest would come later. 10 months later, Daniel stood backstage at Lincoln Center, adjusting his tie for the 5th time. His hands were shaking, not from nerves about performing, but from the weight of what this moment meant. Tonight was his final showcase before Juilliard auditions. The performance that would determine whether all the sacrifice, all the struggle, all the anger and hope had been worth it. Scouts from major conservatories were in the audience. So were journalists from classical music publications. This was his shot. "You ready?" Mr. Chen appeared beside him, placing a steady hand on his shoulder. "I don't know," Daniel admitted.
"What if I'm not good enough?"
"Daniel, I've been teaching for 25 years. I've never been more certain of anything. You're not just good enough. You're exceptional. Now get out there and show them what I already know." Daniel walked onto the stage and the bright lights made it impossible to see the audience. Good. He didn't want to see faces right now. He just wanted to play. He sat at the piano, took a deep breath, and began. The piece was his own composition, the one he'd been refining for over a year. It started with the sound of struggle, harsh and discordant like doors slamming shut. Then it evolved, found melody in the chaos, turned pain into something beautiful. It was his story. Every frustration and triumph. Every moment of being invisible and every moment of being finally, truly seen. His fingers flew across the keys, completely in control yet somehow wild at the same time. He wasn't thinking anymore, just feeling. The music poured out of him like water from a broken dam. Everything he'd been holding inside for 17 years. When he played the final note, there was that same breathless silence he remembered from the charity gala. Then the applause came, thunderous and sustained. People stood. Daniel rose and bowed, and this time he let himself smile. Backstage afterward, he was surrounded by people. Instructors from Juilliard and other conservatories, offering praise and handing him business cards. A journalist wanting to interview him about his journey. Everyone suddenly wanted to know his name, wanted to claim they'd discovered him. Through the crowd, Daniel saw Margaret. She was standing in the back, not pushing forward, just watching. When their eyes met, she nodded once. Not proud, not proprietary, just acknowledging what she'd witnessed. Then she turned and left before he could speak to her. It was the right thing to do, Daniel thought. This moment was his, not hers. His mother was crying when he finally made it through the crowd to her. "I'm so proud of you," Elena said, holding his face in her hands. "Your father would have been so proud. I couldn't have done it without you, Mom, none of it." "Yes, you could have," Elena said firmly. "Your talent is yours. I just made sure you had the chance to use it." 3 weeks later, Daniel got the letter. Full scholarship to Juilliard. Full ride, everything covered. He'd done it. He'd actually done it. He called Mr. Chen first before even telling his mother. "I got in. Full scholarship." There was silence on the other end, then his teacher's voice, thick with emotion. "Daniel, you have no idea how much this means. Not just for you. For every kid I've taught who didn't get this chance. You're carrying them with you too." "I know," Daniel said. "I won't forget them. I promise." That evening, as Daniel and his mother celebrated with cheap takeout in their tiny apartment, there was a knock on the door. Elena opened it to find a messenger with an envelope. Inside was a letter from Margaret. Daniel read it aloud. "Dear Daniel, I won't be at your Juilliard performances. This is your journey, not mine. But I wanted you to know that watching you that night changed something in me. You were right about everything you said. I spent my whole life not seeing people, not really seeing them. I'm trying to do better now. The scholarship fund we discussed is running. Mr. Chen is helping administer it along with teachers from 3 other schools. We've funded 15 students so far. It's not enough, not nearly enough, but it's a start. I still employ your mother, and I hope that's okay. But things are different now. I listen when she talks. I see her as a person, not just someone who works for me. It's a small thing, but it matters. You don't owe me anything, Daniel. Not gratitude, not forgiveness, nothing. But I owe you. You held up a mirror and made me look at myself honestly for the first time in decades. That was a gift, even if it was uncomfortable. I hope Juilliard is everything you dreamed it would be. You earned it, Margaret. Daniel folded the letter carefully. Huh, was all he said. She's trying, Elena said softly. Yeah, I guess she is. Are you still angry? Daniel thought about it. Yes, but maybe not at her specifically anymore. At the system that made it so hard to get here. At all the talented kids who won't get the chances I got. At how much luck and timing and random chance still matters even with talent and hard work. So what are you going to do with that anger? Use it, Daniel said. Turn it into something productive. When I'm successful, I'm going to teach. I'm going to mentor kids like me. I'm going to make sure talent gets recognized regardless of where it comes from. Elena smiled. Your father would have loved that. The next few months passed in a blur of preparation. Daniel graduated from high school with honors. Mr. Chen threw him a small party in the music room where he'd practiced for so many years. His friends from school, the ones who'd stuck by him through everything, celebrated with pizza and off-key singing. On his last day at Lincoln High, Daniel sat at the old, upright piano one final time. It was still out of tune, still missing those 2 keys. But it had been his piano, the one that had seen him through the hardest years. He played a simple melody, something his father had taught him when he was 7, before the cancer took him. A folk song about home and hope and the long road ahead. Thank you, he whispered to the piano, to the room, to all the hours of practice and dreams and determination that had brought him here. Then he closed the lid and walked away, ready for what came next. Juilliard was everything he'd hoped and harder than he'd imagined. He was surrounded by incredibly talented musicians, many of whom had advantages he'd never had. But Daniel held his own, more than held his own, actually. He thrived. His professors recognized something special in him. Not just technical skill, though he had that, but emotional depth, the ability to make music that moved people. That came from his experiences, from knowing what it felt like to be overlooked and underestimated. In his 2nd year, Daniel started a mentoring program, going back to underfunded public schools to work with talented kids who needed guidance. He didn't just teach them music. He taught them how to navigate a system that wasn't built for them, how to be excellent without apology, how to take help when it came without losing themselves in the process. One afternoon, he was working with a 14-year-old girl at a school in Brooklyn. She was brilliant but shy, convinced she wasn't good enough. I don't belong here, she said, looking at the piano like it was an expensive thing she might break. Yes, you do, Daniel said firmly. You belong anywhere your talent can take you. Don't let anyone, including yourself, tell you different. But kids like me don't usually make it. Kids like us, Daniel corrected. And you're right, we don't usually make it. The system is designed that way. But that's changing slowly, and every time one of us succeeds, we make it a little easier for the next person. So play like you mean it, she did, and she was extraordinary. Walking home that evening, Daniel thought about how far he'd come, from being invisible at Margaret's dinner party to studying at one of the world's best music schools, from struggling to find practice time to mentoring the next generation. The anger was still there, would probably always be there, but it had transformed into something useful. Fuel instead of poison. His phone buzzed. A text from his mother. Mrs. Whitmore asked about you today. Says she saw an article about your mentoring program in the Times. She seemed genuinely happy for you. Daniel smiled and typed back, "Tell her I said thanks." It wasn't forgiveness exactly. Margaret had been part of a system that made his journey unnecessarily hard. But she'd also been willing to change, to learn, to do better. That counted for something. More importantly, she'd stayed out of his way. Let him succeed on his own terms. That counted for even more. That night, Daniel composed a new piece. It was lighter than his earlier work, more hopeful. It still acknowledged struggle and pain, but it also celebrated triumph, resilience. the power of refusing to be invisible. He called it seen. It was for every kid who'd ever been overlooked. Every person who'd worked twice as hard for half the recognition. Every dreamer who kept going despite the odds. It was for himself, too. For the boy who'd played background music at a billionaire's party and felt like nothing. For the young man who'd stood his ground and demanded to be recognized on his own terms. For the artist he was becoming. Someone who would use his platform to lift others up. Daniel played the piece through once, then again, refining it. When he finally finished, he sat back and smiled. He'd made it. Not because someone rescued him, but because he'd fought for it. Because his talent was real and his determination was stronger than any obstacle. And this was just the beginning. The best was still ahead, he was sure of it.